one question. My last question, and this is where I'm beginning with you tonight. My last question, Dr. West, that we want to ask you. What would your 66-year-old self say to your 25-year-old self? Almost every time I stutter and I stammer through that response. Sometimes I would say, I don't know what I would say too. And then I started thinking, maybe that's a question you ought to give serious consideration to. What would you say? And then I thought, you have biological sons who are preaching. So what are you saying to them? So for the next few minutes, that's what I want to try to answer. And I want to frame it around maybe Joshua chapters 1 and 3 and 4, just as a frame of getting started about a transition to a new generation, looking toward a future direction. And so what would I say to my younger self? Well, if I look at the story of Joshua, I would probably look at, as I'm thinking out loud about what I would say to my younger self, that there are periods in life where you will have to face big crossing overs. In the same way that Hannibal of North Africa would cross the Alps and gather an army of more than 30,000 foot soldiers, 8,000 cavalry, and some 31 African elephants to pierce the sky as the Libyans saw them approaching. And them saying to Hannibal, we could never do anything like this. And he said, yes, you can. And we can cross over and we can affront the north side of Rome. Or to consider a young man at 25 or 21 thereabout, who's a mail carrier looking at the cartouche, his map, looking at his coordinates, looking at the sky and gathering his 4 sandwiches, his 2 canteens of water, putting 451 gallons of fuel in his little plane and setting its course toward Nova Scotia. And then 33 hours and 29 minutes later, arriving in Paris, France, Charles Lindbergh. We then know something about the significance and the importance of crossing over in transitions. That would probably be the one thing that I would say to my younger self, and that would be my challenge to each of you, is to write down 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 things tonight as you're listening or when you return to your hotel or home, to say, let me write down some legacy principles for a generation that's coming after me, who are not only preaching, but those who will be teaching in music, those who will be serving. As we entered in, and a young man greeted the bishop, and Bishop Clark greeted him and thanked him for serving. I said, how do we preserve that in the crossing overs to pass those principles down to a new generation? The last few years have reminded us of how delicate time is. When COVID approached us, everything that we thought was nailed down looked like it started coming loose. And so our ability to pass down in the transitions of life these lasting principles that are important to a generation coming. That's what happened to Joshua. Just using him as a frame in broad strokes, Moses had died. And Moses had taken Israel as far as God would allow him to take them. And now that Moses is gone, now Joshua. In this big transition, how would this new person lead this group of people into what some have called the Joshua generation. My old self started thinking about my younger self when I had been called to one of my churches in my 20s. I've been called to Greater Zion Hill Missionary Baptist Church. Zion Hill is still operative. It's in Brookshire, Texas. My church is in Houston, 6 miles west from Katy, and maybe 10 miles from Katy is Brookshire. In 1982, that was a lifetime away from where I grew up. Now I'm in the shadow of the place where I started in pastoral ministry. Brother Whitaker was a deacon in our church, and he worked with a man named Lawrence Herbert Bosdick. They were in the Masons. They were Masons. They were the leaders. They were the grand worshipful masters. I think I'm saying it right. I don't mean to be offensive. And L.H. Bosdick held that position, and he was the chairman of the deacons at Zion Hill Baptist Church. I was 22 years old, on the threshold of 23. I just got kicked out of my first church. This is true, and this is true. It's all of this is going to come back or in a few minutes, you know. And so, but I was living the life. I was young. I was married, and I was preaching every week. I was making a lot of money. My average offering was $150. So I was big baller shot caller. I mean, you can tell. I had grown up in Houston, and so I'd gone to college. I'm gone to seminary now, and I'm having fun because I'm preaching for everybody. Everybody. I reached national preaching acclaim at 23 years old because of my pastor, who said, I have a son. This is where I meet Dr. Massey. That's a whole nother story. And so doors opened for me. Brother Whitaker in my home church said to Bosdick, who said to him, man, we're without a pastor. And if you know anybody interested to coming to Brookshire, which is only 12 miles from where I am now, but at that time it looked like a lifetime away. And Brother Whitaker said, we have a young preacher in our church named Ralph West. And if you give him a chance, he said, I think you're going to like him, L.H. I drove up on the campus, and Brother Bosdick, who I'd never seen before in my life, was standing there. He walked out to the car, and tears were rolling down his eyes. And L.H. said, our pastor is here. That became the beginning of a very, very meaningful relationship. His sons are in my church. I've buried their mother, father, all the sisters and brothers. L.H. became my man. It was the biggest lesson I learned, and this is a lesson that I try to pass down, and I wish my younger self would have known what was happening the way my old self know now. And that is the power of influence. I wish that I had known that. It would have saved me an enormous amount of church conflict. I wouldn't learn that lesson. That's 1980, 283 I'm talking about now. I wouldn't learn that lesson until 1990, 91 in a conference on the power of influence. Because leadership is influence. Probably the most important words I've ever learned is these 6 words: everything rises and falls on leadership. You know, And leadership is the ability to obtain followers. You know, a lot of people think they're leading and nobody's following, and therefore they're just taking a walk, you know. But I wish I had learned that, because that day when I met L.H. Bosdick, I found out later that he could have made my life a living misery or all the peace. Do you remember this cowboy sitcom, this western called Bonanza? Yes, sir. Well, that's who L.H. Bosdick was. He was Ben Cartwright. I mean, he had made his money in oil. He was a big rancher. He raised Burma bulls. I didn't know what any of that meant then. Bosdick may have had a high school. He may have gone to college, you know, but all his children were accomplished. Psychiatrist, surgeon, medical doctor, educator like Ruby Bosdick, the mother. But that was the big lesson that I learned there, was the power of influence under him. Another lesson I learned there one Saturday was how attitude changes or determines the altitude. I could be a very, very scathing person. It was my protection. It was the way that I guarded myself, because remember, at 2021, I was pastoring and got put out the church. And so I vowed nobody would ever talk to me a particular way, and they would never approach me a certain kind of way. And so I carried myself in a way that you would just sit down and just say, I don't want to have nothing to do with him, and I would say, I don't want to have nothing to do with you. Now, you got to hear me now, because all of this is shaping. Something is being shaped here, all right? But I learned that day how attitude can change the altitude. And it happened one Sunday at Ruby Bosdick's kitchen. She had raised sons, so mothers who raise sons know how to talk to boys. Now, if you haven't raised boys, this is a different group. Boys are different from any other. Ain't nothing like raising boys. I told them I don't do good with them girls, but Lord, I can work with them boys. And she said, Brother Pastor, you know, you can attract more bees with honey than with vinegar. I was eating, I didn't know what she was talking about. and she said this to me, she said, you got that big smile and that big laugh. You're going to be all right when you learn how to use it. That was a lesson I learned that day. It was affirmed by my favorite uncle. My favorite uncle is a philosopher, James Wilbert Shepard. He's a Pepperdine Harvard man, ex-Marine, Vietnam War veteran, 3 tours. And this is all he wrote me a note. He said, nephew, that's what he called me, Rev Nephew. Rev Nephew, I sure wish I could see that smile of yours a lot more than what I do. Attitude. It was solidified on a Saturday when I was upset with the janitor or the sexton or the cleanup crew, and the building looked a mess to me. Now this is my father in me now who cleaned up everything, and I can hear him in my head now saying that everything has a place. So things look like they're out of place. So I was mopping the floor. Bosdick, this time not the mother or the father, but the daughter, came in and said, that's what I like to see, a preacher at work. I was mad. I wanted to throw the bucket at him. But yeah, I really did, because I didn't find it funny. And then my mind immediately went to a sermon that I've been writing from John chapter 13. Now, don't judge me. I'm looking at some of you a little upset with me. This is my story. And remember, I'm only 23 years old at this time. That's another thing that you have to say to church people. As a young man was called to church and everybody was mad at him, I said, well, how old is he? He said, they said, he's 21 years old. I said, well, how old is the church? They said, our church is 98 years old. I said, well, how old are the members? They said, 98. I told them, I said, 21, 22, 23-year-olds, that's all. They can only give you what they know. And I remember Jesus in John 13 going into a room and washing his disciples' feet. Attitude. And I learned that day the importance of attitude. I really did, which factors into if your attitude is right, it can change the altitude and the atmosphere of the place what you're doing ministry. Now, there were other lessons I learned, but I want to go somewhere else because what Zion Hill proved out to be would be boot camp. Those of you who've been in the service, I asked a gentleman who was on my staff for years, I asked that favorite uncle, I said, what is boot camp? What's the whole purpose of this boot camp? But one serviceman in my church, he said it this way, and he was an officer. He said, well, let's put it this way. In boot camp, you are being stripped down from all of your civilian ways. Man, I didn't like that. And yet, I wish I had time. I'll tell you about my military experience in college. I am a big-time ROTC person. And, yeah, I'm in the military. Yeah, but let me squeeze that in then. Well, I'll put it at another time. But I asked him, I said, what does it do? He said, it does. I said, so what Zion Hill was, it served very much like boot camp. But you know, once you're in boot camp, you don't stay in boot camp forever. Once you get out of boot camp, you know, you have to go out into the field. And so I'm preaching, and I'm only at Zion Hill for right at 18 months, right at 2 years, and I get a call walking through the airport. I was preaching in New Orleans, Louisiana. I remember it. I'm on a Sunday night flight. I see Brother and Sister Turner, who knew my mother, and all of them used to sing together. And they said, Ralph, our church is vacant. I knew of the church. It's in Houston because Zion Hill is in the country. I told you it's only 10 miles, 12 miles from where I am now. And so that's how the city has grown. But here, Greater Mount Zion is in the heart of Houston. It's in the Independent Heights. So this is going to be good because I'm going to the city because I'm a city boy. Yes, and I like the city. I grew up in a healthy church, so I don't know what it means to be in a quote-unquote dysfunctional church. I don't understand that. I grew up in one of the largest churches in Houston. I love big churches. I love a lot of people. That's all I've been around. That's all I knew. And my pastor was so beloved, I thought that this was automatic with, I thought, you know, if you get called to, this is automatic. This is how people are going to treat you. While we're writing notes for the generation to come, tell them that ain't true. And I wish, as gifted as my pastor was, that he would have sat down and said, let me teach you some lessons about leadership, pastoring and leadership. I learned them much later, but at this time is when I needed them. So I get called to Greater Mount Zion. I stayed there 3.5 years, and they say, you know, honeymoon. We had no honeymoon. We were irreconcilable from the beginning. Yeah, I mean, this is true. My first Sunday, there, the second Sunday, I just, no other term I know, fired all the deacons except for a few of them. This is good. Yeah, I fired them. So what you do have in me, as my wife would say, whatever his other flaws are, pastorally, he is courageous. I believe if God is with me, I'm just going, you know. And so, you know, they reneged on everything that we agreed on. So I just said, well, I don't need them, you know. So that you can imagine. Now, let me give you the lessons I learned in the first 7 days that have been with me, yes, for all my pastoral ministry now. It wasn't all their fault now. The biggest, and this is what I tell it could be staff, senior pastor, whatever it is, learn the history of the place where you're going. Now, I'm going to tell you something. Now, I went to a church, and I was invited by the new young preacher, and he's doing good. And that's what he said to me publicly. Now, this church is older than he, and it is. He says, this church had never done this, this, and this until I came here. I said, oh, Lord. I said, he ain't going to be here long. The ministry doesn't begin when you get there. There's a history. So what I didn't factor into and understanding their story are the prices that have been paid to get them to where they are. I didn't pay any attention to that. It meant nothing to me. I didn't know who the people were that I was getting rid of. And I later found out that everybody was married to everybody or had been married to everybody. I'm not trying to make this is real. So because I told you I did it in the first 7 days. That's why I said in the first, what I learned immediately. So when I'm sitting here and I'm hearing these names, these not cousins. We talking about brother and sister, ex this, ex that, adopted this, godparent. I said, Lord, I got myself into a mess. Didn't understand the history. Pastor West, what is your advice to the new person who's there? Just spend some time reading whatever they have, knowing about who they are. Now, let me tell you why that's important. One day, and not too far in the future, I'm going to be stepping aside. And I said this one Sunday morning. I got tickled. This is how this idea popped into my head. I said, one day somebody's going to come here, and they're going to say, I know people say Wes is this and that, but I'm going to let you know, man, they hadn't done none of this until I got here. And I told the church, I said, as soon as they said, even as one of my children, that day stand up and put them out. Even as my son. So the history of the church, understand the history. Another lesson that I learned of value there, because I was just moving all kind of stuff around. After I calmed down and looked like things had calmed down, they never had, to be honest. It was just always some groundswell for all the time that I was there. I learned another lesson, and that is I don't have to fight somebody else's battle. I mean, so they had issues with each other and certain things that had nothing to do with me, but I wasn't wise enough to just simply say, that doesn't involve me. Or to say, I would love to get the two of you in a room and the two of you could talk about that together, not me being the referee. Because I found out every battle that they had, they wanted me in the room with them. And then their battle became, there you go, my battle. It's just a lesson that I learned. I grew up more in that church than the 38 years this year at the church where I'm at. Let me show you what happened. If you've never had a real church fight, I pray you never have one. If you've never had, I'm not talking about a disagreement, I'm talking about church fight. I'm talking about church fight where the police, there you go. There you go. So when you hear me talking, there's not some guy up here say he's an arrogant something and he did. No. This is where Massey becomes so important in my life, because he's with me during this period right here. He's the person that's praying for me and talking to me during this period right here. The time that I'm away at Princeton is I don't know why the people gave me a chance to be away that long, and yet, you know, it was my saving point. So I'm not just out trying to rouse a response. If you've never had a church fight, I'm talking about church fight. I can remember the day it started. It started the first week when I fired the deacons. It started the week when they reneged on what they said they was going to do for me. You know, they started and I went with it. You know, I grew up in Fifth Ward, and you know, there you go. Okay, look like somebody know about the nickel. So you know, I don't care who you are. You can be the valedictorian. You got to know how to handle yourself in the wards. You know, it's just part of what you know. I mean, you know. And I said, man, this ain't good. So third weekend in March, 1987. I hear Linda Davis screaming in church. What in the world is Linda screaming in church? She said, I cannot believe that they're doing this to my pastor. And I'm like, what? And I get a sheet of paper with 18 allegations on them of why we want him gone. It's amazing how funny things get 38 years away from, but they're not funny when you, when you read it for the first, it say, what? Now, I've always been contemporary. I'm not the person who ever had to try to keep up with culture. I was the guy who always wore braids. I was always, you know, wore leather, always wore boots, all that. I was always in style and ahead of it sometimes. So I was young. I'm just in my 20s in this church. So I didn't think nothing was wrong with wearing leather pants and boots, and, you know, that's how I dress. That's why I say I'm from the wards, you know. So I didn't know. See, because remember, I come a healthy church at home, which is a traditional church. But when nobody never tripped about that, because in the ward, you styled in the ward, you know. You get my point. So when I'm coming over, not from the ward, I'm over now into Independent Heights, which is a different kind of mindset. That was one of the allegations. He wearing leather pants. Let me tell you something. My wife found the papers the other day for my 50th anniversary. She said, Ralph, you're not going to believe what I found. I found the letters of the church that sent you. I was glad, because I said, I don't want anybody to think I'm making these kind of things up. I used to wear a goatee. And I used to wear my Bobby Womack glasses, you know. Then when I had hair, you know. And I didn't know. I'm going somewhere with all this. I've been waiting for years to tell this story. I have never had a chance to really tell it. You know what I'm saying? This is catharsis. I'm getting it out, and I appreciate this. And so I'm sitting there, and that was on there. He wears a goatee, jeans, but under his robe, because I wasn't trying. That's why I made the comment that I've always been in style. So I wasn't trying to make a statement. I just felt like, well, I'm going in to do this. I just put my robe over it. I'm not walking in with tennis shoes on. I'm putting shoes on, but my robe long. That didn't count. So all that was. Then he allows the women to come to church with pants on. Well, I didn't know that these things were so taboo. Because I come from a traditional church. And it wasn't until later I said, Pastor, he said, I said, these ladies, look, if y'all, this is what I said in my church, y'all. I said, well, they've been work all day, so they got to go home, change to come to church. I said, these are people you know. They grew up in this church. You've known them all your life. And that started a big fight because now Pastor West is pitting our children against us. I'm not even thinking about this like that, but now that I've had time to, and talk to people. Okay, I got to speed this up now. Here's when the police get involved. Yeah. And I have kind of a wry sense of humor, dry sense of humor. So it was. We had this black paper, the Forward Time, and they got it on there, the black page, and the black page is where all the hot topics come up. And Zolly Scales, who was a big politician, he's gone on to be with the Lord now, saw this article. He said, look, you can't put his name in there. Because my mother worked with these political people and stuff. Say, you can't put the name in there. So they did not put my name in the article. It just simply says, young preacher at West 835 Street in the Independent Heights is trying to put these people out of their house. Because I was asking, hey, had you thought about us buying this land? And, or he's trying, and that was it. He's trying to put, so the police are in now. And the police show up. I was preaching that week. Well, first the police show up, and then I don't know this meeting is going on because I'm leaving. I'm going to Charlotte, North Carolina for Cliff Anthony Jones. I come back on a Thursday, and I'm just stopping by the church to go in. They got this huge meeting. And I don't know the meeting going on. I'm out of town, but I'm back that day, and I just sat in the office to listen to all the wonderful things that the people were saying about me. Randolph West, bless his heart, he's a blessed memory. He's gone on to be with the Lord. Stood up and said, maybe he has done things not the way we want them done, but you cannot refute that our church has done this, young people have done this, children, but we don't care. And this is what they said in the meeting. We didn't bring him here to bring all these people to this church. Now, that's what they said. Now, you can go find this. I can show this to you. They said, we didn't bring him here to bring all these people. I was very popular, okay? All the preachers I preached for in Houston, I was very popular. I was their boy. You get me? You know how it is. You got to say, well, I was everybody's boy. Now, like my whole ministry, I've always had women in ministry. Women always. It's never been a pressure. My pastor never had that. And they asked him once, they said, well, you go preach for Ralph, and he got women in ministry, and he said these words, and I quote, well, Ralph can't get it all right. He can't get everything right, So I was everybody's preacher. I mean, when you was out of town and you was out of town, you was out of town, who's going to preach? Call Ralph. Ralph's going to preach for us while we're out of town. So you can imagine when the police, and this is social media, it's a firestorm in the community. Because the doors are locked. And I get there early and I can't get in. I'm just sure I'm a kind of naive dude. So I'm trying to put my key in the lock. I can't get in. And I go around the corner to Brother Pellerim's house and I said, Brother P, can he get in? He started crying. He said, they changed the locks. I said, okay, do you have a key to the new lock? I'm just trying to get in. That's all I'm trying to do. He said, well, the lock has changed so you can't get in. I said, okay. So now the police is there. Sergeant Davis show up that morning. I know who his name is because Sergeant Davis is kind of like a distant relative because 3.5 years when I first got caught at church, Brother Davis, Sergeant Davis drove by. He said, Ralph, I said, how you doing, Sergeant Davis? He said, we having a reunion in Clark, Texas. He said, would you come preach? I said, yes, sir. Well, I just returned the favor 3.5 years later. I said, Sergeant Davis said, hey, Ralph. I said, look, man, I'm locked out of my church. I got to get past it. And so he shows up and I get in there. It's a mess. It's just a mayhem. It's falling out. I knew then it was time to go. The lesson I learned is that when the fires are burning, don't add fuel to the fire. Wasn't no need, If I'd known those embers and those sparks, if I identified in that way, I would have backed. I would say, leave that alone. Leave that alone. Leave it alone. But God, remember, I'm an old athlete. I don't mind fighting, wrestling, tussling. But the old me now would say, ain't worth it. Because you don't want, of the people who get injured in the fight, you don't want to do something where you lose a soul in the fight, And sometimes you lose in order to win. I learned that lesson. So in the middle of all this, I can't tell you this story. I get called to another church. It's in Beaumont, Texas, 86 miles east of Houston. Beaumont is oil money. So when you read the story of Standard Oil, Gulf Oil, Texaco, you hear spindle top oil, and they say that's what spindle top oil. A lot of you, if there's any alphas in here, this is where Bill Jones' church is, who used to be our old president from way back. This is Bill's church. And I preached there, and I knew when I preached, I said, oh, these people are going to call me. I just knew it. It was just the reaction. It was more than enthusiasm. I knew they was going to call me. I learned a big lesson out of this. Had a big church meeting. I'm going to tell you about that. We'll talk about it another time. And they called me. And I knew that night. I negotiated a deal. This was a deal of deals. I had inside information that they didn't know I had because of my pastor in St. Louis. I did. His sister was a member of the church. He said, whatever they offer you, take it. Don't argue with them. They offer you whatever, take it. But once you agree, just say these words, I thought you would have done better, knowing that you had 3 investment accounts in Payne Webber. I had insight. So everybody went haywire. How in the world did he know that? I said, you did your research on me, I did mine on you. I'm going somewhere now. So everything I wanted, I got. The cars, the houses, the money. And I knew it wasn't the place to go, and I didn't go. That's my lesson I learned. I'm speeding through because I got to wrap it up. It's because, and here's the lesson, every door that open ain't your opportunity. That's what I'm trying to get to. And you can imagine coming out of a church fight, I have to leave Great Mount Zion. You already know that now. You know that. It's like, you out of here. I told them I'd give them 2 weeks. They say, boy, we fired you 3 weeks ago. Yeah, they did, because I told them I would preach, over the net. They said, oh, no, you ain't got to do that, If we give you the day to get your stuff out here, and I did. But every door that opened doesn't mean it's your opportunity to walk into. I learned that lesson. And you can imagine the people that was talking now about me to say, my goodness, can't keep a church, but to say, here you are getting, in Beaumont. Yeah, it ain't on the main drag, but you in the Golden Triangle, Beaumont, Orange, Port Arthur. You're right on the cusp of Lake Charles. Man, you can do whatever you want there. And they did. They gave me everything that I asked for, including annual raises and all this stuff. And I said, I can't come here. I know this ain't where the Lord want me. My wife would go with me anywhere that I go. That's what she told me. And we have family in this part of the country. You see, we got family over here. So I know this is appealing now because we got family there. And later when I said, I just know this is not where the Lord is leading us, she said, God still answers prayers. let me wrap it up. And so that goes the beginning of Brook Hollow Baptist Church. Now, interestingly, the church where I serve, God had already purposed that church in my heart a year before all of this happened. I believe all that had to happen to wrestle me out of. Because remember, I grew up in a healthy church, a traditional church, and I'd already had it mapped out. And mine was, I want to go work at a church where the pastor built it. And I just come in and be his successor. Yeah. I would know how to treat the pastor. I would know how to take care of the pastor. But all that business of building this, working that, I don't know nothing about it, and I don't want to do it. And yet, it was those experiences that had me to do what I'm doing. Can I give you one last story? And we can talk about the church I was some other time. But I'm just talking about lessons learned. I got some lessons learned there. So in all of that, kicked out of Fruitdale, pastoring Zion Hill, the lessons that you learn at Greater Mount Zion, that was one experience that would later take 27 years to manifest itself to wrap everything up, okay? The day that Bosdick met me at the doorsteps and said, our pastor's here. There was a young man named James Mays who worked for ExxonMobil who was on trial for deacon. And Bosdick told me who he was, and I said, well, I can't use him. I said, I would need my deacons here. But his job required that he would travel, and he couldn't be there. This man had paid his dues to lead that church. And I said, I can't use him. You can't lose this story and forget how I described myself 40 minutes ago. And so I said, I can't use it. Bosdick went in and said, James, the pastor cannot use you now. He was hurt, he was tearful. I didn't care. Because remember, you got to hear the story in the context that I told you in describing myself earlier. If you're just listening now, you say, he's rude. I already told you of how I was shaped and why I did what I did. Can't use you. That's what I said. 27 years later, our church it just grows. It just grows. It's all over the place. It's 6, 7 services, just everywhere. Who in the world is going to serve this church to give leadership to these deacons? Because my deacon ministry is huge. It's about, 168 of them, and it's big. And I rely on these people because these are the people that the only reason why I can't be here tomorrow night, I'll be here during all day, and I got to get out of here is because my deacon died, Monroe Brown. These are people who, how do you pastor a church like that? People always, I say, through these people here. who's going to, but you got to have a leader. You got to have a leader, somebody who can lead this group. 27 years later, unknown to me, of what I said 27 years earlier, I put a phone call to a man named James Mays. I said, Brother Mays, I need to talk to you. I said, Mays, I need somebody to lead our deacon ministry. And I prayed about it, and you are the person that I know God has given to me to lead it. He said, you don't remember me. You don't remember me. 27 years ago, I was on trial to be a deacon. And you said, I can't use you. And Bostic said, he didn't say he can't use you. He said he can't use you now. And 27 years later, that would be the man who would care for that church and to make that church pastorally cared for. And the lesson I learned on waiting is that it may not come to you now, but if you wait and serve, it will come. I learned that lesson. If it's anything this old self would say to a young self, is to sit down and say, just because it has not come to you now does not mean that God has forgotten where you are. It does not mean that God doesn't know your address. It doesn't mean God knows where you are. Lord have mercy. And so those are some of the lessons that myself today would tell my younger self. And you say, can you wrap it up in a statement? I sure can. All I've said is what my pastor said later to me in a conversation that made all the sense in the world. He said, Ralph, remember 3 things. And if you can remember these things as it relate to God, you can succeed. Number 1, be patient. Be patient. Number 2, be patient. And number 3, be patient.
Wow. Wow. Let's stand together. Wow. Yeah, ooh-wee. Wow. What a glimpse into a life. What a privilege Dr. West just gave us to be that transparent. Some of us know it. A lot of it I had forgotten. In fact, there was one church I had forgotten about. But to hear it again and to see what God has done with him at Brook Hollow, AKA Church Without Walls, is to see the benefit of a man who patiently waited on God. And I hope you were touched by his pastoral heart. That Ralph Douglas West is one of the finest pastors I know. I want us to take a moment. It's 6:56. We have 4 minutes. to take a moment, because whether you work in the corporate world or you work in the church world, these principles are transferable. Some of you tomorrow will go to a job where you're at odds with somebody. Some of you have been let go. You've been fired. See, it isn't just preachers, it's you too. What might you learn from Dr. West's journey and the lessons he picked up along the way? Take a moment and just allow the Spirit of God to talk to you to make portable and transportable these truths, these lessons. What's your attitude like? Are you getting in battles that are not yours? In your ministry, usher, greeter, music, you getting in a battle. On your job, you are getting in the middle of something that's none of your business. And you letting folk drag you into something. Have you built up some walls where you got hurt once and you say, "Now, I'm not going to let that happen to me again"? And so people want to love you and work with you on your job, and you're suspicious and you're reticent and resistant, even in the church. Just take everything he said and do a little checklist. How am I doing